Emeka must provide 12 million naira.
Emeka, my father never wanted us to be together.
So the 12 million was never a price. It was a wall.
Let us run away to Enugu and get married.
My fiancé's father demanded an absurd bride price that nearly ended our engagement. Emeka was still holding the tray of kola nuts when Chief Adigun said the number out loud, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that parlor moved. Not the aunties fanning themselves in the corner, not Chidinma sitting stiff-backed beside her mother, not even the old family friend who had come along as the traditional spokesman and whose entire job that afternoon was to know how to answer a bride price gracefully. 12 million naira. Not counting the 7 cows, the 12 kegs of palm wine, the 200 yards of the finest Hollandese lace, the gold jewelry set from a specific jeweler in Lagos whose name Chief Adigun wrote on a slip of paper and slid across the table like a man closing a business deal. And, strangest of all, a fully furnished 3-bedroom bungalow in Chief Adigun's hometown, titled in his name to be completed within 6 months of the introduction. Emeka's spokesman, a man who had negotiated bride prices for 30 years and thought he had heard every trick a difficult father could invent, actually laughed once before catching himself, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound that he tried and failed to turn into a cough. "Chief," the spokesman said carefully, "with respect, this is not a bride price. This is a punishment." Chief Adigun did not blink. He was a tall, broad man in his 60s, with a voice that filled rooms without him raising it, a retired customs official who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to make ordinary people feel small across a desk, and he used every bit of that skill now, folding his hands over his stomach and smiling the particular smile of a man who has already decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. "Call it whatever you like," Chief Adigun said. "My daughter is not for sale cheaply. If the young man cannot afford to honor her properly, then perhaps he should have thought of that before he came into my house asking for her hand." If you're new here, subscribe before you go any further, because what Chief Adigun was really doing in that parlor that afternoon had almost nothing to do with money, and by the time Emeka and Chidinma discovered the real reason behind that number, it would nearly cost them the marriage entirely. Emeka set the tray down slowly, aware of every eye in the room watching to see how a 29-year-old software engineer with a comfortable but ordinary salary would respond to being told in the politest possible language that he was not good enough. He looked at Chidinma. She was staring at her hands in her lap, her jaw tight, a muscle working at the side of her face that Emeka had learned in 2 years of loving her meant she was holding back words that would get her in trouble if she let them out in front of her father. He looked back at Chief Adigun. "I will find a way to meet it," Emeka said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Every part of it." Chief Adigun's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes flickered, the particular disappointment of a man whose trap had not sprung the way he expected. "We shall see," he said. The drive home that evening was quiet in the specific way that meant Chidinma was thinking too hard to speak, and Emeka let her sit with it because he had learned that pushing her before she was ready only made her retreat further. It was not until they were parked outside her flat, the engine ticking as it cooled, street lights throwing long orange stripes across the dashboard, that she finally spoke. "He doesn't want me to marry you," she said. "This isn't about tradition. My father has never asked for a bride price like that for anyone. My cousin Ifeyinwa married last year, and the entire bride price, including the cows, came to under 2 million naira. "Then why?" Emeka asked, though some part of him had already begun to assemble an answer he did not want to hear. "Because you're not who he wanted," Chidinma said quietly. "He's had someone else in mind for me for 2 years, Barrister Kola Fashina's son. Their families have business together, land deals. My father sits on a board with Kola's father. If I marry into that family, it strengthens something my father has been building for a decade. If I marry you, a software engineer from a family he considers, in his words, unremarkable, it gains him nothing." Emeka sat with that for a long moment, watching a moth circle the street lamp outside, throwing itself again and again against light it could never actually reach. So the 12 million, he said slowly, isn't a price, it's a wall. It's a wall he's built to look like a price, Chidinma said, so that when you fail to climb it, he can say it was never about him disliking you. He can say the market decided. He can say love wasn't enough, without ever having to admit he chose it that way. Here is the part of this story where a weaker man might have walked away, might have decided that a father determined to sabotage a marriage from the beginning was a father not worth fighting, that a woman raised inside that kind of calculation was destined eventually to inherit some of it. But Emeka did not think that way, not about Chidinma, because in 2 years of loving her, he had learned that she was in every way that mattered, the opposite of her father. Generous where he was calculating, direct where he was strategic. And he told her exactly that as they sat in the car that night. "I'm not walking away from this," Emeka said, "but I need you to be honest with me about one thing. If I can't raise it, if I fail this wall your father built, does that mean it's over between us?" Chidinma turned to look at him fully then, her eyes bright in the dim orange light. "No," she said, without hesitation. "It means my father hasn't finished trying, and neither have I." Emeka spent the next 3 weeks doing arithmetic that never quite worked, laying his savings against the number Chief Adigun had named, and watching the gap refuse to close no matter which way he arranged it. He had a little over 2 million saved, built carefully over 4 years of a career that paid well by ordinary standards, but not by the standards a retired customs chief with a taste for humiliation had decided to invoke. He called his father in Nollywood, a retired school teacher who raised 3 children on a civil servant salary and taught them above almost anything else the danger of debt, and explained the number out loud, hearing how absurd it sounded even in his own mouth. There was a long silence on the line, the particular silence of a father doing his own arithmetic against a lifetime of frugal living. 12 million naira, his father repeated, plus a house. Plus a house, Papa. "Emeka, this is not a bride price. This man is telling you no in a very expensive language." "I know," Emeka said, "but I love her and she loves me. I'm not going to let a number decide that for us." His father was quiet again, and when he spoke this time, his voice had softened into something Emeka recognized from childhood, the tone his father used only when he was about to say something he had turned over carefully in his mind before allowing himself to say it. "Then we fight it the way our people have always fought this kind of thing. Not with money we don't have, with patience the other man doesn't expect us to have. Go back and negotiate the parts that can be negotiated. The cows, the wine, the lace, those things move with conversation. It's the 12 million and the house he's using as the real wall, so that's where you push." In between those visits, Emeka did what any determined man in his position does when the front door refuses to open. He started testing the windows. He took a second contract on the weekends, building an inventory system for a small logistics company owned by a former university roommate, work that ate into his Saturdays and left him blurry-eyed on Monday mornings, but added, slowly, to a savings figure that still looked laughably small beside 12 million naira. He asked his mother gently whether the small parcel of family land in Nollywood that sat idle for a decade might be worth selling, and watched her face fall in a way that told him, without her having to say it, exactly how much that land meant to a woman who had buried her own mother's placenta beneath one of its trees. He did not ask again. He asked 2 older cousins who had done well in Lagos for loans, and both agreed, generously, though even their combined contribution left the gap between what he had and what Chief Adigun demanded, looking like a hill to climb, more like a cliff face with no visible handholds. Chidinma, watching him work himself thin, trying to satisfy a number she was increasingly certain her father had never intended to be met, began quietly making calculations of her own. She ran a small event planning business that had done well but was nowhere near enough to close the gap on its own. Waited for his grant of permission and closed the door behind her before she could talk herself out of what she had come to see. "Papa, I need to understand something," she said, standing rather than sitting, because sitting felt like giving him a posture of comfort he had not earned. "Is there any amount Emeka could bring you that would actually satisfy this bride price? Or is the number itself not the point?" Chief Adigun set down his newspaper slowly, studying his daughter with the particular assessing look he usually reserved for junior officers who had disappointed him. "What kind of question is that?" "A direct one," Chidinma said. "You've never asked a bride price like this for anyone in this family. If any was a fraction of it. So either you believe Emeka is worth 6 times what my cousin's husband was worth, which we both know isn't the reasoning, or you built a number you don't actually expect him to reach." For a moment, something almost like respect crossed her father's face, quickly buried under the same performed authority he used on everyone. He said, "I built a number that reflects your value. You are my only daughter. You have 3 degrees. You run a business worth more than that young man's yearly salary. Why should I hand you over for the price of an ordinary girl?" "Because I'm not being handed over," Chidinma said, her voice rising now despite herself. "I'm choosing him. That's what this is supposed to be, Papa, not a transaction, a blessing on a choice I've already made." Chief Adigun set down his brandy down with a small, deliberate click against the side table. The kind of controlled gesture he used, Chidinma knew from a lifetime of watching him negotiate everything from land disputes to church committee budgets, whenever he wanted the other person to notice how calm he was managing to stay. "You speak of choice as though you made it in a vacuum," he said. "You met this young man at a wedding, danced with him twice, and 3 months later you are telling me he is the one. I have watched marriages built on that kind of choosing collapse within 2 years, Chidinma, when the excitement wears off and what remains is a man who cannot provide the life you were raised to expect." "He provides plenty," Chidinma said. "He provides more than plenty. What he doesn't provide is a business alliance with Barrister Fashina, and that's the only ledger you are actually reading from." Her father's eyes narrowed slightly, the first genuine flicker of surprise she had managed to provoke in him. "Watch how you speak to me in my own house." "I am watching. I am watching very closely, Papa, which is exactly why I noticed that you've never once asked me a single question about Emeka's character, not one. You've asked about his salary, his family's land, his father's pension. You have never once asked me whether he is kind, whether he listens when I speak, whether he makes me want to build a life, because none of that is on your ledger. And if I don't bless it, then I suppose you'll have taught me exactly what all your talk about honor and tradition was actually worth," Chidinma said, and she watched something in her father's face harden into the specific stillness he wore when he had decided a conversation was over, whether or not the other person agreed. "You will marry Kola's son," Chief Adigun said quietly now, which was somehow worse than shouting. "I have already spoken to his father. The families are aligned. This is not a discussion. This is a decision that was made before you brought that boy into my house." Chidinma stood very still, absorbing the fact that her father had, apparently, been negotiating her marriage to another man's son at the exact same time he was extracting an impossible bride price from the man she actually loved, a betrayal so complete it took her a moment to find her voice again. "You were never going to let this happen," she said slowly. "Not for any price. This was never a wall Emeka could climb. It was a door you had already locked." Her father did not deny it. That silence, more than anything he could have said, told her everything. She left the study without another word, walked past her mother in the hallway without meeting her eyes, and did not stop walking until she was in her car, hands shaking on the steering wheel exactly the way Emeka's had shaken weeks earlier over a very different kind of betrayal. And she drove straight to his flat and told him everything through tears she had been too proud to let her father see. "He's already promised me to someone else," she said. "The bride price was never real. He wanted you to fail so he'd have an excuse to say the market decided, but the whole time he'd already decided for himself." Emeka sat with her on his small balcony that night, the city humming below them, and felt something shift inside him, the particular clarity that comes when a person finally understands the true shape of the obstacle in front of them. "Then we are not fighting a bride price anymore," he said. "We are fighting a decision your father made before I ever walked into his parlor, and I don't think there is a number on earth that changes a decision like that." Chidinma wiped her eyes and looked at him for a long moment. Then, what do we do? If you have ever loved someone whose family had already decided you were not enough before you had the chance to prove otherwise, you understand exactly what Chidinma and Emeka were facing that night. And if you are wondering whether love actually wins in a story like this one, stay with me, because what they decided to do next would change the entire direction of both their families, and it's not the choice you are expecting. Subscribe now if this story has you invested, because the next part moves fast. They talked until nearly 3 in the morning, turning over every option. And it was Chidinma, not Emeka, who first said the word neither of them had quite dared to say out loud. We elope. Emeka went still. Chidinma, your father will never forgive that. You know how he is about appearances, about what people will say. He's already promised me to someone else, Chidinma said. He's already lied to your face about a bride price he never intended to let you meet. What exactly am I protecting by staying inside his rules, Emeka? A relationship with a man who was willing to sacrifice my entire future for a business alliance? It was not a decision either of them made lightly, and it was, Emeka would insist later, whenever anyone asked, a decision made out of the same clarity his own father had described weeks earlier. Patience running out, love refusing to wait for permission that was never coming. Planning it took nearly 2 weeks, longer than either of them expected, because eloping quietly turns out to require its own strange, meticulous logistics, a registrar willing to process the paperwork on short notice, witnesses who could be trusted not to mention it to the wrong person before the ceremony was safely done, an explanation ready for Chidinma's staff about why she would be traveling unexpectedly for a few days. There were moments during those 2 weeks that Chidinma nearly called it off, not because she doubted Emeka, but because some deeply conditioned part of her still recoiled at the idea of a wedding day without her father walking her in, without the traditional blessing she had watched performed at every cousin's wedding since she was a child, without the version of the day she had quietly pictured for herself since she was young enough to still believe her father's approval and her own happiness were the same thing. We can wait, Emeka told her gently, the night before they were due to travel, watching her stare at her packed suitcase like it belonged to someone else. If you need more time, Chidinma, we wait. I'm not in a hurry to build something you'll spend years feeling robbed of. I don't need more time, Chidinma said finally, closing the suitcase with more force than necessary. I need to stop measuring my wedding day by the version I imagined when I was 12 years old and didn't yet know my father's love came with an invoice attached. They chose Enugu, a state neither family had strong roots in. Close enough to reach within a day's drive, but distant enough that no relative would stumble onto the ceremony by accident. Emeka's parents, when told, reacted with the particular mixture of worry and quiet pride that only people who had raised a child to think for himself could manage. His father especially, who said only, "If the man has already made his decision without telling you, you are not the one breaking tradition by making yours." Chidinma told no one on her side of the family, not even her mother. Not because she doubted her mother's love, but because she knew, with painful certainty, that her mother's loyalty to her father's authority would put the woman in an impossible position the moment she found out. The wedding itself was small, almost bare by the standards either family was accustomed to. A registration ceremony in a government office with peeling paint on the walls, followed by a modest traditional blessing performed by an uncle of Emeka's who was also a pastor. The whole affair costing less than the gold jewelry set alone on Chief Adigun's original list. Chidinma wore a simple cream dress she had bought 2 days earlier, without trying it on properly, and Emeka wore his worn good suit, and there were perhaps 15 people in the room. And when the registrar pronounced them married, Chidinma found herself laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed not by the grandeur she had been raised to expect from her own wedding day, but by the sheer, uncomplicated relief of finally choosing something for herself. Chief Adigun found out 4 days later from a cousin who had somehow heard through the particular gossip network that moves faster than official news in families like his, and the phone call he placed to his daughter that evening was unlike any conversation they had ever had. his voice shaking with fury that Chidinma had rarely heard from him, not even during her rebellious teenage years. "You have humiliated me. You have humiliated this family. Do you understand what people will say? That my daughter ran off like a common girl with no father, no name, no upbringing." "I understand exactly what people will say, Papa. They'll say your daughter chose her own husband because her father had already promised her to someone else without telling her. Which of those two stories embarrasses you more, Papa? The truth or the one you are currently telling yourself?" He hung up on her. He did not call again for 6 weeks. If you think this is where the story ends, a rebellious daughter, an angry father, a marriage that begins under the shadow of estrangement, stay with me. Because what happened during those 6 weeks of silence revealed something about Chief Adigun that neither Chidinma nor Emeka expected. And it's the reason this story doesn't end where you think it does. Subscribe now, because the final turn is coming. The 6 weeks of silence were harder on Chidinma than she let Emeka see. She threw herself into her business, taking on more events than she comfortably had capacity for, filling the hours that would otherwise have been spent replaying her father's furious phone call, the particular way his voice cracked on the word humiliated. A crack that told her, underneath the anger, there was something closer to grief than fury, though she was not yet ready to examine what that meant. She noticed in those weeks the small ways her mother tried to keep a thread open between them without ever technically defying her husband. A forwarded photo of a family gathering with no comment attached. A market bag of her favorite stockfish left with the gate man at her flat with no note. Gestures that said, without saying, "I have not abandoned you," even if your father has not yet found his way to saying the same. Emeka, for his part, spent those weeks quietly grieving a version of his marriage he had not realized he wanted until it was withheld from him. The version where his wife's father embraced him at family gatherings, where there was no careful math involved in which relatives could be invited to which event without provoking Chief Adigun's temper. He did not say this to Chidinma directly, not wanting to add his own disappointment to a burden she was already carrying. But she noticed it anyway. The particular quiet that settled over him on Sunday afternoons, the day his own father called weekly to check on them and, without meaning to, always asked how things stood with her side of the family. The silence, when it finally broke, did not break the way either of them expected. It was not Chief Adigun who called first, and it was not an apology. It was Chidinma's mother, calling quietly one Tuesday afternoon while her husband was out. Her voice careful in the way of a woman who had spent 30 years learning to say difficult things without appearing to say them. "Your father has been unwell," she said. "His blood pressure. The doctor has told him to reduce stress, and instead he sits in that study every evening, reading old photographs of you as a child and refusing to speak about any of it." Chidinma felt something complicated move through her. Not quite forgiveness, not quite guilt, but a recognition that the man who built an impossible wall out of pride was, underneath, still her father, still capable of grief, even when he could not admit it out loud. "Does he know you called me?" Chidinma asked. "No," her mother said, "and I would rather he didn't find out, at least not yet. I called because I think if you don't reach out first, he will let his pride keep both of you apart until it's too late to undo the damage. I know my husband, Chidinma. He will never call first. It is not in him. But that doesn't mean he is not waiting for someone to give him a door he can walk through without losing his dignity." Chidinma sat with that advice for 3 days before she acted on it. And when she finally did, she did not call. She went in person, alone, without Emeka, because some part of her understood that whatever conversation needed to happen next had to happen between a father and his daughter before it could happen between two families. She found him in the study, exactly where her mother said she would be, an old photograph album open on the desk before him. A picture of Chidinma at perhaps 7, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on his shoulders at what looked like a school fair. He closed it quickly when she entered, as though caught at something shameful. "You came," he said. "Mommy told me you've been unwell." "Your mother talks too much," he said, but there was no real anger in it. Only the tired deflection of a man who did not know how to begin the conversation he actually wanted to have. Chidinma sat down across from him,
in the same chair she had stood beside months earlier when she confronted him about the bride price. And this time she waited, letting the silence stretch until her father was the one who finally broke it. "I did not want you to marry beneath your worth," he said slowly, staring at the closed photograph album rather than at her. "That is the truth I have not said out loud to anyone, not even my mother. I built that number because I convinced myself that a man who could not meet it did not deserve you. And when I arranged things with Kola's family, I told myself it was strategy, business, sense. But sitting here these past weeks, I have had to ask myself an uncomfortable question. Was I protecting your worth, Chidinma, or was I protecting my own idea of what your worth should be used for?" It was, Chidinma would say later, the closest her father had ever come to an apology in his entire life, and she understood watching him say it, how much it had cost him. "I love him, Papa," she said quietly. Not because he could meet a number, because he never stopped trying to, even when he had every reason to walk away. And because when I told you the truth about what you'd done, he didn't tell me to go along with your plan to keep the peace. He asked me what I wanted, and then he stood beside whatever I chose. Chief Adigun was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally looked up at her, there was something in his face Chidinma had never seen there before. Not the performed authority he wore for negotiations, not the calculated disappointment he wore for people who failed his test, but something closer to plain, unguarded regret.
"Bring him," he said finally. "Not for a bride price. I have no more use for that number. It has already cost me more than it was ever worth. Bring him so that I can look the man my daughter chose in the eye and decide for myself without a wall between us whether I was wrong about him." Emeka spent the drive to Chief Adigun's house rehearsing what he might say, discarding one opening line after another, none of them feeling honest enough for a conversation he suspected would determine the shape of his marriage for years to come. In the end, when Chief Adigun waved him into the study and gestured, almost formally, to the chair across the desk, Emeka abandoned every rehearsed line and simply told the truth. "I'm not here to convince you I deserve her, sir. I've thought about that for months, and I've decided it isn't a question I can answer for you. Only Chidinma can decide who deserves her, and she already has. I'm here because she loves you, in spite of everything, and because I would rather spend the next 40 years building something honest with you than spend them pretending this conversation never needs to happen." Chief Adigun studied him for a long moment, the same assessing look he had once turned on Emeka across a parlor table stacked with an impossible list of demands. Although something in it had softened, whether from the illness his wife had mentioned or simply from the slow erosion of 6 weeks spent alone with old photographs, Emeka could not tell. "Do you know why I chose that number?" Chief Adigun asked finally. "I think I do now," Emeka said carefully. "I don't think it was ever really about me." "No," the older man admitted, turning his glass slowly on the desk without drinking from it. "It was about a fear I carried since she was small, that everything I built, my name, my position, the things I sacrificed to give her a life better than the one I had, would end up mattering to no one but me. That she would marry a stranger to my world, and my world would simply close behind her like water. I told myself I was testing your resolve. I was really testing whether I still mattered." He looked up. "That is not a fair thing to place on a young man's shoulders. I understand that now, sitting in this room with my daughter gone 6 weeks and a granddaughter someday who I nearly guaranteed would grow up without knowing me." It was as close to a confession as Chief Adigun had ever offered anyone, and Emeka understood, listening to it, that the old man's pride would never allow him to say these exact words to Chidinma directly, that this admission, offered instead to the son-in-law he once tried to price out of existence, was itself the apology, delivered sideways, the only way a man like Chief Adigun knew how to deliver one. "You still matter, sir. Whether you ever admit that number was never really about a bride price. She still calls you Papa every time your name comes up. That doesn't close even when it hurt. Emeka came 2 weeks later, alone this time as well, at Chidinma's suggestion, because she understood that whatever pride her father needed to set down would be easier to set down without an audience. The conversation between the two men lasted nearly 2 hours behind the closed door of that same study, and neither Chidinma nor her mother, waiting anxiously in the parlor, ever knew every detail of what was said inside it. But when the door finally opened, Chief Adigun's hand was resting on Emeka's shoulder, not gripping it the way a man grips something he intends to control, but resting there the way an older man rests his hand on someone he has decided, finally, to trust. Word of the reconciliation moved through the extended family faster than the elopement itself had, and not everyone received it warmly. An uncle on Chief Adigun's side, a man who had long positioned himself as the guardian of family propriety, made a point of telling anyone who would listen that Chief Adigun had lost control of his household, that allowing a daughter to marry without proper process set a dangerous precedent for younger cousins watching closely. Chief Adigun, to Chidinma's quiet astonishment, shut the conversation down himself at a family function 2 months later, telling his uncle in front of a room full of relatives that he had spent 30 years mistaking control for love, and he did not intend to spend the next 30 repeating the mistake for an audience. It was, Chidinma would later say, the moment she finally believed her father's change was not a performance staged for her benefit alone, but something he was willing to defend even when she was not in the room to see it. There was no grand traditional ceremony to redo what the registration office in Enugu had already made legal. No 7 cows, no titled bungalow, no gold jewelry set from the specific jeweler whose name Chief Adigun had written on a slip of paper like the terms of a contract. Instead, 6 months later, Chief Adigun hosted a modest dinner at his house, extended family only, and stood to give a short toast that surprised everyone in the room, including, visibly, his own wife. "I built a wall for my daughter," he said, raising his glass, his voice steadier than anyone expected. "And I told myself I was protecting her. But a man who loves you enough to climb every wall you build and still stays to knock on the door after you've locked it from the inside, that man was never the one who needed testing. I was." Chidinma, sitting beside Emeka with her hand in his under the table, found she could not speak for a moment, overwhelmed by a version of her father she had waited her entire life to meet and almost given up believing existed. It would be unhonest to say everything between them healed cleanly after that dinner. Chief Adigun remained in many ways the same man he had always been, still sometimes sharp with his opinions, still prone to reminding Emeka, half in jest and half not, exactly how much money he once had been willing to demand for his daughter's hand. A joke that took nearly a year before it actually sounded like a joke and not a lingering threat. But something fundamental had shifted, a door that was once locked from the inside now standing open, imperfectly, unevenly, but open. And Chidinma understood, watching her parents and her husband share a meal for the first time without tension curling under every sentence, that this was probably the most honest kind of reconciliation available to people who had hurt each other as deeply as her father and her marriage had. If there is a lesson sitting in this story, it is not the simple one people often want, that love always wins in the end, that every difficult father eventually softens if you wait long enough. Chidinma herself would tell you if you asked her that they were fortunate, that not every parent finds their way back through pride to something honest, that some walls stay standing for a lifetime and the people who love each other are left to build a life entirely outside them without ever getting the reconciliation they hoped for. What she learned instead, she says, was simpler and harder than a fairy tale ending. That a price someone sets for your worth is rarely actually about your worth at all, and that the only number that ever really mattered in that entire ordeal was the number of times Emeka chose to stay when leaving would have been so much easier. She and Emeka welcomed their first child 2 years later, a daughter, and Chief Adigun,
holding his granddaughter in the same study where he once demanded 12 million naira and a titled bungalow for the right to love his own child, told Chidinma quietly that he hoped whenever this little girl grew old enough to bring a man home, that he would remember exactly what walls cost the people who build them and let her choose her own door instead. If Chidinma and Emeka's story moved you tonight, don't scroll past without subscribing, because stories like theirs about love tested by pride, by money, by the walls families build without always understanding why, are the ones we bring you every week on this channel. And there's another story waiting for you that might hit closer to home than you expect.